Imagine being wrongfully accused, silenced, and humiliated, only to find the courage to stand against the very people who hold power over you. In today's story, we'll follow Josh, a young man who faces unimaginable injustice as he battles against corruption and abuse. When he chooses to speak up, he faces threats and attempts to destroy his life. Will he succeed in uncovering the truth? Watch to find out, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you believe in standing up for justice. Stay with us to the end. You won't want to miss how this powerful story unfolds. Josh Parker leaned against the doorframe of his father's study, hands tucked into his jeans pockets, bracing himself for the familiar conversation that would ensue. General Parker sat at his wide, mahogany desk, his posture rigid as if he were conducting a briefing, not speaking to his only son. The room was filled with military memorabilia, plaques, medals, and photographs chronicling a life dedicated to service. It was an imposing space, a shrine to the discipline and structure that had shaped General Parker's career and life. "Josh," General Parker began, his voice controlled but sharp, "have you given any more thought to enlisting?" Josh sighed, the question a painfully recurring theme in their conversations. His father seemed to think a career in the military was an obligation, something he owed not only to his family name, but to the legacy General Parker had worked so hard to build. "Dad," Josh said carefully, trying to keep his tone even, "I've told you, I have other plans. College, for one. And after that, I just want to carve my own path." General Parker's brows knit together, the disappointment evident even as he kept his expression neutral. "Carving your own path. Do you even realize what that means?" he asked, his tone thick with skepticism. "Do you know how many young men I've seen flounder because they thought carving their own path was a substitute for discipline and structure?" Josh's jaw tightened. He had heard this lecture countless times. Every interaction with his father felt like a battle of wills, each of them firm in their own convictions. It wasn't that Josh didn't respect his father's commitment to the military, he just didn't share it. But every attempt to communicate this difference only seemed to deepen the rift between them. "Maybe I don't know exactly what I want yet," Josh admitted, crossing his arms, "but I know I don't want to be in the military." "I'm not you, Dad." The silence that followed his words was thick, filled with unsaid accusations and disappointment. General Parker looked away, his gaze falling on a photograph of his younger self in uniform, his arm draped proudly around his own father, a veteran himself. "Do you think I had a choice, Josh?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a murmur. "Do you think I always wanted this? Or that my father gave me a choice?" Josh shifted uncomfortably, not expecting this moment of vulnerability from his father. But before he could say anything, the general straightened, his expression returning to its familiar sternness. "Regardless," General Parker continued, "you're an adult now. I can't force you to see reason. But one day, Josh, you'll understand what duty means. And it might be too late by then." Josh bit back a retort, sensing that there was no more room for discussion. The familiar frustration flared up within him, mingling with the sadness that his father couldn't seem to understand or accept him for who he was. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left, leaving General Parker alone in his study, staring silently at his medals and photographs. Later that evening, Josh found himself walking through the city streets, his thoughts swirling. The conversation with his father had left him feeling hollow and restless, a heavy weight in his chest that he couldn't shake. The cool evening air offered little comfort, but it was better than being cooped up in the house, surrounded by reminders of the expectations he couldn't meet. Josh loved his father, but hated the way he seemed to be constantly measured against a standard he'd never agreed to uphold. He wanted something different, something that was his own, free from the shadows cast by generations of military tradition. But explaining this to his father was like trying to explain color to someone who'd only ever seen the world in shades of black and white. As he walked, Josh didn't notice the two police officers, Crane and Miller, watching him from across the street. To them, Josh was just another young man, wandering the streets at night, a potential troublemaker. Crane nudged Miller, nodding toward Josh with a smirk. "Looks like we've got ourselves a wanderer," Crane muttered. "Bet he's up to something." Miller chuckled, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Let's go have a word with him." A little midnight entertainment, right? The two officers made their way across the street, and Josh was so lost in thought he didn't notice them until they were standing directly in his path. He looked up, surprised, as Crane gave him a cold smile. "Out for a late-night stroll, are we?" Crane asked, his tone mocking. Josh frowned, immediately sensing the tension in the air. "Is there a problem, officers?" "Depends," Miller replied, crossing his arms as he surveyed Josh. "What are you doing out here? Doesn't seem like you belong around here." Josh felt his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He'd done nothing wrong, but the insinuation in their words was clear. They were treating him like a suspect, like he was somehow out of place. He glanced around, realizing they had cornered him against the side of a building, blocking his path. "I'm just taking a walk," Josh said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Last I checked, that's not illegal." Crane's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. "Watch your tone, kid. We don't take kindly to disrespect." The words hit Josh like a slap, and he felt his anger flare up. He wanted to push back, to tell these officers that they had no right to treat him this way, but he knew better than to antagonize them. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to rein in his frustration. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his voice laced with barely contained anger. "I just want to go on my way." But Crane and Miller weren't about to let him off that easily. There was something in the defiant set of his jaw, the way he looked at them without fear, that seemed to provoke them even more. Miller stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "Looks like we've got a tough guy here. Thinks he can mouth off to us." Josh clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to respond. He'd dealt with authority figures all his life, his father's lectures, his teacher's expectations. But this was different. This was pure intimidation, designed to make him feel small and powerless. And as much as he wanted to stand his ground, he knew that any resistance would only make things worse. The two officers exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them, and before Josh could react, they'd grabbed him, pressing him against the wall with unnecessary force. Josh gasped, the shock of the cold, unyielding brick against his face making his pulse race. "Hey!" he protested, his voice muffled against the wall. "I haven't done anything." Crane leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "That's what they all say, kid. Now, why don't you come with us and we'll sort this out?" Josh could feel his heart pounding as they dragged him away, his mind reeling. He'd done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. He thought of his father's words about duty and respect, and a bitter sense of irony settled in his chest. General Parker's influence meant nothing here. To these officers, he was just another nobody, another troublemaker they could push around. As they loaded him into the police car, Josh felt a swell of anger and helplessness he hadn't experienced before. This wasn't the life he wanted, but here he was, entangled in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. The cold, metallic echo of the police station was overwhelming as Josh was pushed through the narrow hallway, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh, sterile glow on everything beneath them. His arms ached from being yanked behind his back, and his wrists were sore from the tightness of the handcuffs biting into his skin. Crane and Miller followed close behind, their footsteps slow and deliberate, as though savoring each second of Josh's discomfort. "You're making a mistake," Josh muttered, trying to keep his voice steady as he glanced over his shoulder at the officers. "I haven't done anything wrong." Crane snorted, giving him a smirk. "Oh, I bet you haven't. Just a law-abiding citizen, right? Taking a stroll through the wrong part of town at the wrong time." Josh's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together in frustration. He knew better than to argue, but the injustice of it all was clawing at him, burning in his chest. "I told you, I was just taking a walk. Is that a crime now?" Miller laughed, his voice thick with mockery. "Maybe not, but you see, son, you gave us reason to be suspicious. acting all defensive, asking questions. Makes you look guilty, doesn't it? Josh could feel his pulse racing, the blood roaring in his ears. He wanted to shout, to demand that they release him, to tell them exactly who his father was and watch the look of shock on their faces. But a part of him held back, knowing that any sign of resistance would only give them another excuse to mistreat him. They stopped outside a dingy interrogation room, and Crane gave Josh a rough shove forward, sending him stumbling into the room. Josh caught himself, breathing heavily as he stood there, his heart pounding as he took in the dim, claustrophobic space. A single metal table sat in the center of the room, with 2 chairs on either side. The air smelled stale, with a faint scent of antiseptic and something else, something acrid that lingered, like a distant memory of fear and desperation. Crane and Miller entered the room, positioning themselves on either side of Josh, their smug expressions never faltering. Crane gestured to the chair in front of him. "Take a seat, kid." Reluctantly, Josh sat down, feeling the cold metal against his back as he slouched into the chair, his wrists still cuffed. He looked up at them, refusing to let the fear show in his eyes, though he could feel it creeping in, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Crane leaned over the table, his face inches from Josh's. "You think you're tough, don't you? Walking around at night, mouthing off to the cops." Josh's nostrils flared as he met Crane's gaze, holding it steady. "I wasn't mouthing off. I was minding my own business, and you're the ones who decided to make this a problem. Is that right?" Miller chimed in, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Seems like you've got a real attitude problem, kid. Maybe it's time someone taught you a little respect." The words cut deep, and Josh felt his stomach churn with frustration and resentment. He glanced away, focusing on the scuffed floor beneath him, the peeling paint on the walls, anything to keep himself grounded. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until Crane broke it with a low chuckle. "Look at you," Crane sneered, "acting like you're better than everyone else, like you don't have to follow the rules." Josh snapped his gaze back to Crane, his eyes blazing. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just think it's wrong to be treated like a criminal for no reason." Crane's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "You think you're some kind of saint? You don't get it, do you? People like you think you can walk around without consequences. Well, not tonight." Josh felt a chill run down his spine at Crane's words, at the barely concealed threat behind them. He swallowed, forcing himself to hold his ground. "I have rights," he managed, his voice wavering slightly. "You can't do this," Miller snorted, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "Oh, he's talking about his rights. Tell me, kid, who's gonna believe you? Just another punk trying to act tough. I've seen plenty like you, and trust me, they all fold in the end." A flare of indignation rose in Josh's chest, and he clenched his fists, even as the handcuffs dug painfully into his wrists. "You don't know anything about me." Crane chuckled again, this time more menacingly. "Oh, I think we know plenty. You're just some spoiled kid, aren't you? Probably used to getting what you want, thinking the world owes you something." Josh shook his head, feeling the weight of their accusations pressing down on him, suffocating him. "You have no idea what I've been through. I just want to live my life without being harassed." "Oh, poor you," Crane said mockingly, feigning sympathy. "Life's hard. Huh? Must be tough being a kid who thinks he can talk back to us and get away with it." The words stung, but Josh refused to let them see how deeply they affected him. Instead, he took a shaky breath, focusing on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, trying to calm the storm inside him. The longer he sat there, the clearer it became that they had no intention of letting him go anytime soon. Suddenly, Miller's expression shifted, a spark of curiosity lighting up his eyes. "You're awfully quiet, kid. Got something to hide?" Josh's face twisted in frustration. "There's nothing to hide," he said through gritted teeth. "I've told you everything. I was just walking. That's it." Crane and Miller exchanged a look, their smug grins growing wider as they loomed over him. Crane leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "Well, we're gonna find out if that's true. And if you've been lying, let's just say it won't end well for you." Josh's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. He was trapped, cornered, with no one to turn to and no one who would listen. The walls seemed to close in around him, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a constant reminder of his helplessness. For the first time, he felt the gravity of his situation settle heavily on his shoulders, a crushing weight that threatened to pull him under. He didn't know how long he would be stuck here, or if anyone would believe his side of the story. All he knew was that he was alone, left to face the wrath of two officers who saw him as nothing more than a target. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Josh's mind began to race with thoughts of his father. The irony wasn't lost on him. The son of a general, locked in a dingy interrogation room, stripped of his dignity and treated like a criminal. He wondered if his father would ever know what was happening to him, if he would care enough to intervene. But even as these thoughts swirled in his mind, a part of him felt a strange sense of defiance. He might be alone, but he wasn't powerless. He wouldn't give these officers the satisfaction of breaking him, no matter how bleak things seemed. He was Josh Parker, and if nothing else, he had his pride. Hours slipped by in the stifling air of the interrogation room. Josh's hands were numb, his wrists raw from the cuffs that pressed against his skin with every subtle movement. He had lost track of time. The only measure of its passage was the growing discomfort in his muscles and the simmering frustration in his mind. The door opened abruptly, and a new figure entered the room. Tall, sharp-featured, with a severe expression that seemed permanently etched onto his face, Officer Crane's superior, Sergeant Lucas, was now in charge. His presence filled the small room, the air thickening as he glanced over Josh with an assessing look. "All right, kid," Lucas began, pulling out a chair opposite Josh and taking a seat with a slow, deliberate manner. His gaze was cold, almost clinical, as though he were sizing Josh up, measuring every twitch, every breath. "Are you ready to explain what you were doing out there?" Josh felt his muscles tense at the question, the accusatory edge in the sergeant's voice igniting his irritation. "I've already explained," he replied, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage. "I was walking." "That's it." Lucas raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Just walking," he echoed, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Seems a bit suspicious, don't you think? Wandering around, late at night, looking restless." Josh's fists clenched under the table, hidden from view. "It's not a crime to walk, is it?" he challenged, holding Lucas's gaze, refusing to let himself be intimidated. Lucas smirked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table as he locked eyes with Josh. "You see, son, sometimes it's not what you're doing, but the way you're doing it. The attitude, the sense that you're above the rules." Josh could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "With all due respect, sir, you don't know anything about me." A small chuckle escaped Lucas's lips, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "Oh, I know more than you think. I know your type. Think you're untouchable, that you're smarter than everyone else. But trust me," he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're just like everyone else once you're here." The words were like a slap, a harsh reminder of the power imbalance he was facing. Josh bit the inside of his cheek, fighting back the anger and the fear that clawed at his composure. "I'm here because of some twisted idea you and your officers have about people who don't fit in." His voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor of indignation beneath it. Lucas's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading as a hardness settled into his gaze. "Watch it, kid. You're on thin ice as it is." Josh inhaled deeply, his chest tight, feeling the words bubbling up, unchecked. "You're the ones who brought me here without a reason. You're the ones treating me like a criminal when all I was doing was minding my business." Lucas's jaw clenched, and a flash of irritation passed over his face. He stood up suddenly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the floor, and he leaned over Josh, his presence imposing and unyielding. "Do you think this is some kind of game? Do you think you can mouth off to me and walk out of here scot-free?" Josh looked up, defiance sparking in his eyes. "I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask for any of this." Lucas's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a threatening murmur. "I don't care what you think you asked for. The sooner you learn your place, the better for you. Because out there, maybe you think you're somebody, but in here, you're just another nobody. The words hit Josh hard, a sickening wave of helplessness washing over him. The raw truth of Lucas's words settled like a heavy weight on his chest, each syllable resonating with a bitter finality. He was trapped, held under the thumb of a man who had no intention of seeing him as anything more than a suspect, a statistic, a nobody. Lucas straightened, his gaze lingering on Josh with a cold satisfaction, as if savoring the impact of his words. "Now," he said, his tone softer but no less menacing, "are you going to cooperate? Or are we going to have more problems?" Josh swallowed, his voice thick as he forced out a response. "I've told you everything there is to tell. I was just walking." Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile, a hollow and calculated expression that held no warmth. "Well, maybe a few more hours in here will help you remember if you've forgotten anything." Without another word, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Josh alone in the silence once more. Hours passed with Josh sitting alone in the interrogation room, his mind racing and body aching. He felt every tick of the clock, each second dragging longer than the last. Just as his exhaustion began to weigh him down, the door creaked open again, and this time, a different officer, a younger man with a softer demeanor, entered the room, carrying a cup of water and a look of sympathy that immediately set him apart from Crane, Miller, and Lucas. "Here," the officer said quietly, setting the cup down in front of Josh. "You must be thirsty." Josh stared at the water, then looked up at the officer, his guard immediately up. "Thanks, I guess," he murmured cautiously, lifting the cup to his lips, feeling the cool water soothe his dry throat. The officer took a seat across from him, adjusting his cap and glancing at Josh with an uncertain expression. Officer Reed," he said, as if testing the waters. "I've been asked to check in on you." Josh scoffed, setting the empty cup back on the table. "Oh yeah? Check on me, or make sure I haven't forgotten anything?" Reed winced, his gaze dropping momentarily. "I know it must feel that way," he said softly, his tone almost apologetic. "But look, sometimes things just get blown out of proportion, all right? You might not be in as much trouble as it seems." Josh leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Then why am I still here? Why haven't they let me go if I'm not in trouble?" Reed took a breath, leaning back in his chair, and shook his head slightly. "Sometimes, guys like Lucas, they get caught up in making sure everything's under control. They don't like it when people push back." Josh's frustration flared. "So I'm supposed to sit here and let them treat me like a criminal? Just because they don't like it when people stand up for themselves?" Reed's gaze softened, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "Look, man, I get it. I know it's not fair, but I'm not in charge here. I'm just trying to make sure things don't get worse for you." Josh crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "And how am I supposed to trust you? You're part of this. You're just sitting back, letting them do whatever they want. Doesn't that make you complicit?" Reed hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he looked away, an uncomfortable silence settling over them. "You're not wrong," he admitted quietly. "But not everyone in here is like Crane or Lucas. Some of us just don't have a choice." Josh studied Reed, sensing a reluctance in his words, a conflict that hinted at something deeper. He could see the discomfort flickering in Reed's eyes, as if the young officer was wrestling with something he couldn't say out loud. Reed leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If I could tell you to walk out of here, I would. But this place, this system, it doesn't work that way. You're just another number in a long line, and they're going to keep treating you like one until they're done with you." Josh's eyes hardened as he absorbed Reed's words, the bitter reality settling over him. "So what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice laced with resignation. "Just sit here and let them tear me apart because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Reed's gaze fell to his hands. He sighed, a hint of guilt in his expression. "I wish I had a better answer, kid. Sometimes the only way out is to get through." Josh clenched his fists under the table, fighting the frustration and the helplessness building inside him. "You know, it's funny," he said bitterly. My father always told me that discipline and respect could get me through anything, that if I followed the rules, I'd be fine. But I guess he never considered this kind of situation. Reed's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. Your father? He sounds strict. Josh snorted, shaking his head. Strict doesn't even begin to cover it. He's a general. My whole life, it's been about duty, respect, doing things by the book. And now? I don't even know what that means anymore. A faint smile touched Reed's lips, a trace of empathy in his eyes. Must be tough, living up to expectations like that. Josh nodded, the weariness in his shoulders evident as he leaned back. I'm not even trying to live up to it. I just want to be my own person. But no matter what I do, it's like I'm either disappointing him or disappointing myself. Reed's gaze softened, and he seemed to consider his next words carefully. Look, Josh, people like Lucas, they don't care who you are or who your father is. But I'm gonna try to keep an eye on things, okay? I know that doesn't mean much, but maybe it'll help a little. Josh held Reed's gaze, searching for any hint of deception. Why are you even trying to help me? He asked, a trace of skepticism in his voice. Reed shrugged, glancing down as he fiddled with his badge. Because I see a lot of people come through here, and not all of them deserve what they get. Maybe I can't change much, but sometimes, just knowing someone's trying to do the right thing can make a difference. Josh looked away, his throat tightening as the weight of Reed's words hit him. He wanted to trust him, but a part of him knew that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Before Reed could say anything else, the door swung open and Lucas re-entered, his cold gaze locking onto Reed. Officer Reed, your break's over. Get back to patrol. Reed straightened, his expression tightening as he gave Josh one last, lingering look. Take care of yourself, he murmured, so low that only Josh could hear. With a reluctant nod, Reed left, leaving Josh alone once more with Lucas. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he regarded Josh, a smug smirk curling his lips. Making friends, are we? Lucas sneered, his tone laced with mockery. Don't get too comfortable. Not everyone's as soft as Reed. Josh bit his tongue, his gaze hardening as he watched Lucas settle into the chair across from him. You must feel real big, don't you? Josh muttered, unable to hold back his frustration. Pushing people around, making them feel small. That's what gives you power, right? Lucas's eyes flashed, but his smile only widened. You think this is about power? No, kid. This is about order. Discipline. The kind your generation has no respect for. Josh felt his jaw clench, a wave of defiance rising within him. Discipline? He echoed bitterly. You mean control. Control over people who can't fight back. People who don't have a voice. Lucas's expression darkened, his smile vanishing. Watch yourself, Parker. You're walking a fine line. Josh's heart pounded, but he didn't look away. Funny, you don't seem to know what a fine line is. You just cross it whenever you want, don't you? Lucas's nostrils flared, but he held his composure. I'll enjoy watching you learn a thing or two, kid. People like you. You don't last long in the real world. Josh sat back, his gaze unwavering. Maybe, but I'll last long enough to watch people like you get what's coming. Lucas's lips thinned, his fists clenching as he stared at Josh with a seething fury. But he said nothing, the silence stretching between them, heavy and charged. The door clicked shut behind Lucas, leaving Josh alone once more, the air thick with tension. He could feel the weight of every word that had passed between them, every accusation, every threat, hanging in the room like a storm waiting to break. For the first time, a flicker of hope sparked within him, not from Reed's words, not from any assurance of justice, but from his own resolve. He wouldn't let them break him. Not now. Not ever. After Lucas left, Josh remained alone in the cold, unforgiving silence of the interrogation room, a mixture of anger and frustration brewing inside him. Time felt distorted, every second stretching out in the dim light. Just as his exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, the door creaked open again, and both Crane and Miller stepped in, their faces twisted in smug satisfaction. Well, Crane began. his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Thought you could sit here quietly and ride this out, didn't you?" Josh looked up, meeting their eyes, his own gaze hard and unwavering. "I don't know what you expect from me. I've told you everything," Miller chuckled, folding his arms as he leaned against the wall. "Everything? Oh, I doubt that. See, we're starting to think there's more to you than just a peaceful stroll." Josh clenched his fists, the words fueling his frustration. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm here because of your assumptions and nothing else." Crane's smile widened, the malice in his eyes unmistakable. "Assumptions, huh? So, you think we're just picking on you for no reason?" Josh scoffed, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Seems like it." Miller stepped forward, his voice cold as steel. "You watch your tone, kid. You're already in over your head." Josh met Miller's glare with steady defiance. "All because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time? That's how it works now." Crane chuckled, walking around the table, circling Josh like a predator sizing up its prey. "It works however we say it works. Out there, maybe you think you're somebody, but in here, you're nothing." Josh felt the words like a punch to his chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he lifted his chin, his gaze unflinching. "You can push me around all you want, but that doesn't change the truth." Miller's face twisted in anger, and he took a step closer, his voice a low hiss. "The truth is whatever we say it is. You don't have any power here, Parker. None." The weight of their words pressed down on Josh, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. "You think you're so untouchable?" he replied quietly, "but people like you always get what's coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually." Crane's expression darkened, his jaw clenching as he leaned in close to Josh. "Keep talking, kid. See where it gets you." Josh took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I'm not afraid of you." The tension in the room was electric, each word heightening the charged silence. Miller's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, we'll see about that." With a sudden, brutal shove, Crane yanked Josh out of his chair, slamming him against the wall. Josh gasped, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs, but he forced himself to meet Crane's gaze, even as pain shot through his back. "Let's see how tough you are now," Crane taunted, pressing him harder against the cold, unyielding wall. "You think you can come in here and mouth off like that?" Josh struggled against the pressure, his voice hoarse. "I haven't done anything wrong." Crane's grip tightened, his voice a low growl. "Then why does it feel so good seeing you squirm?" Josh's mind raced, his heart pounding as he realized the extent of their malice. He was at their mercy, and they were reveling in it, taking pleasure in the fear and helplessness they'd inflicted. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let them see him falter. Miller stepped closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's wrong, kid? Not so brave now, are you?" Josh forced himself to speak, his words strained but defiant. "Bravery isn't about being reckless. It's about standing up to people like you." Crane released him abruptly, and Josh staggered, catching himself against the wall. His body ached, but he steadied himself, refusing to let the pain break his resolve. "Real tough guy, aren't you?" Crane sneered, stepping back with a look of contempt. "Fine. You want to play hero? See how far it gets you in here." Miller smirked, nodding in agreement. "You'll learn soon enough. We've got all the time in the world, kid." With that, they turned and left, slamming the door behind them. The room fell silent again, the tension lingering like a fog that refused to dissipate. Josh sank down against the wall, breathing heavily, his mind reeling. The ache in his body was nothing compared to the anger simmering beneath his skin. He clenched his fists, the memory of Crane's sneering face burned into his mind. He'd never felt so powerless, so exposed, yet a fierce determination flared within him. He wouldn't let them see him break. Not here. Not now. As he sat there in the silence, he thought of his father, the image of the man who had always taught him that discipline and resilience could conquer any challenge. For the first time, he felt the gap between his father's ideals and the harsh reality he faced. Discipline and resilience were his armor, but even armor could crack under the relentless weight of injustice. As Josh sat alone in the silence of the interrogation room, the bruises from Crane's rough handling beginning to ache, he found himself replaying everything his father had taught him. Respect authority, Josh. Discipline is strength. There's nothing you can't get through if you stay calm and follow the rules. The words seemed hollow now, like a faint echo from a distant life, one that felt disconnected from the reality he faced. The door creaked open once more, and this time, Reed entered quietly, his expression shadowed with worry. He approached Josh carefully, his eyes scanning the bruises on Josh's wrists and arms with a flicker of concern. "Josh," Reed whispered, his voice barely audible as he knelt beside him. "What did they do to you?" Josh looked up, trying to mask the bitterness in his eyes. "What do you think?" "They were teaching me a lesson." His words were laced with sarcasm, though there was a sadness hidden beneath the sharpness. Reed's face twisted in regret. I didn't know it would go this far." Josh shook his head, the frustration clear in his tone. "Didn't you? You've been here long enough to know what guys like them are capable of." Reed shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if he were afraid someone might be listening. "Josh, listen to me. I'm trying to help, but there's only so much I can do." Josh's gaze hardened, his voice low and filled with anger. "So that's it? You're just going to stand by and watch them do this? Watch them break people down because they can?" Reed sighed, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "I'm not like them, Josh, but I don't have the power to change anything. If I try to stand up to Lucas, or even report this, it'll be my job on the line. Maybe worse." Josh looked away, his jaw clenched tightly. "So you're just another part of the system, huh? Just another piece in their game?" Reed's shoulders slumped, his gaze softening with guilt. "It's not as simple as you think, Josh. I know it's wrong, but I can't change the way things work here overnight." Josh's expression softened, though his voice was filled with frustration. "My whole life, I've been taught to respect authority. My father, he drilled it into me. But how am I supposed to respect people who abuse their power?" Reed hesitated, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Maybe the real strength isn't in respecting authority. Maybe it's in knowing when to stand up for yourself, even when the odds are stacked against you." Josh raised his head, his gaze meeting Reed's with a hint of surprise. "You really believe that?" Reed nodded slowly, his voice steady. "Yeah, I do. I see people come through here every day, people who've been beaten down, who've had everything taken from them. Some of them still find a way to stand back up. That's real strength, Josh. And I think you have that." Josh's chest tightened, the words resonating within him in a way he hadn't expected. It was a strange feeling, hope, mingling with the anger and despair that had been building inside him. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, he felt a flicker of something other than helplessness. "Thanks, Reed," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Reed reached out, placing a hand on Josh's shoulder. "I wish I could do more. But for now, just stay strong. Don't let them see they're getting to you. They thrive on that." Before Josh could respond, the door swung open and Lucas stepped in, his cold gaze narrowing at the sight of Reed's hand on Josh's shoulder. "Officer Reed," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "Your shift ended half an hour ago. What are you still doing here?" Reed straightened quickly, dropping his hand and clearing his throat. "Just making sure everything's in order, sir." Lucas's eyes flicked between Reed and Josh, suspicion glinting in his gaze. "Don't waste your time. This one isn't going anywhere," he sneered, his tone filled with contempt. Reed shot Josh a quick, apologetic glance before nodding. "Yes, sir." He gave Josh a final look, a silent encouragement, before he left the room. Once Reed was gone, Lucas closed the door, crossing his arms as he looked down at Josh with a disdainful smirk. "So, Parker," he began, his voice oozing with condescension, "didn't your father ever teach you how to behave?" Josh gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep his composure. "My father taught me a lot of things. Things that men like you wouldn't understand." Lucas raised an eyebrow, chuckling softly. "Is that so? You think because he's a big-shot general, it makes you untouchable?" Josh's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. "I never said that. I don't need his status to know right from wrong." Lucas's smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Is that your way of saying you're better than us?" Josh didn't flinch, his voice steady. "No, it's my way of saying that I won't let you break me." The challenge in his words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Lucas's composure faltered, a flash of anger crossing his face. He leaned in close, his voice a low, threatening whisper. "You're already broken, Parker. You just don't know it yet." Josh felt his chest tighten, but he held Lucas's gaze, refusing to back down. "I think the only broken person here is you." Lucas's face twisted with fury, but he quickly masked it, straightening and stepping back, his cold smirk returning. "We'll see how tough you are when this is over." Josh watched as Lucas left the room, the door slamming shut behind him. He was alone again, the silence settling around him like a weight, but something had changed. Reed's words echoed in his mind, and despite everything, he felt a spark of resolve flicker within him. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about his father's lessons on discipline and respect. He was thinking about the strength to stand up, to endure, even when everything seemed hopeless. Maybe Reed was right. Maybe strength wasn't about following the rules, but about standing firm, even when everything was against you. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and closed his eyes, allowing that small, fierce spark of determination to grow. He might be trapped, but he wasn't defeated. Not yet. Hours later, the door to Josh's cell opened again. This time, it wasn't Reed, Crane, or Miller. A tall, older officer with gray hair and a calmer presence stepped in, clipboard in hand, his eyes glancing over Josh thoughtfully. Josh's body tensed as he stood, bracing himself for yet another interrogation. "Josh Parker?" the officer asked, his voice steady, but not unkind. Josh nodded slowly, his voice wary. "Yes, that's me." The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning Josh with an air of consideration. "I'm Officer Hayes. I'm here to process your release." Josh's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "Release? Does that mean I can leave?" Hayes nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "That's right. You'll be able to go soon. We just need to get a few things in order." Josh could barely contain his relief, a weight lifting from his chest as he allowed himself to breathe, truly breathe, for the first time since he'd been brought in. Thank you," he said, struggling to keep the hope out of his voice, afraid it might vanish if he showed it too openly. Hayes gestured for Josh to follow him, and they walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, each step echoing off the concrete walls. As they walked, Hayes glanced over at Josh, a trace of curiosity in his eyes. "You don't look like the type that ends up here," Hayes said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Josh frowned, glancing sideways at the officer. "I shouldn't be here," he replied, his voice filled with the frustration and exhaustion of the last several hours. "I was just walking, and the next thing I know, I'm being dragged in like a criminal." Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Sometimes, these things can get out of hand. People let their egos do the talking." Josh's jaw clenched as he remembered the smug faces of Crane, Miller, and Lucas, their voices taunting him, treating him like nothing. "You're telling me..." They reached another room, much brighter and cleaner than the one he'd been held in, with a table and chairs that didn't look like they'd been scavenged from a dungeon. Hayes gestured for Josh to sit, and he took a seat, feeling a strange sense of relief in the more open, welcoming space. "So," Hayes began, flipping through a few pages on his clipboard, "before you're free to go, we'll need to confirm a few details." "Just a formality, you understand?" Josh nodded, his gaze following Hayes's every movement, the hope in his chest growing stronger with each word. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Now, I understand that some misunderstandings have taken place here. If you'd like, you can file a report. It won't be easy, but it's possible to hold officers accountable for their actions." Josh felt his pulse quicken, a surge of anger and relief mingling together. "They treated me like dirt. Crane, Miller, Lucas, they acted like I was some threat just because I was out on the street." Hayes nodded, a flicker of sympathy in his gaze. I've seen it happen before. Men in power sometimes forget what they're supposed to stand for. If you file a report, it might start the process of holding them accountable. Josh hesitated, the anger boiling in his chest warring with the exhaustion that weighed on his mind. And what happens if I don't? Hayes looked down at his clipboard, his expression unreadable. Then you leave here tonight, and maybe they learn nothing. Josh felt his throat tighten, a sense of helplessness gnawing at him. So it's my responsibility to teach them? Hayes's gaze softened. It shouldn't be. But the truth is, it often falls on people like you to make them see their mistakes. For a moment, Josh considered it. Filing a report, trying to make sure Crane, Miller, and Lucas faced some kind of consequence. But then he remembered their faces, the smug way they'd spoken to him, their confidence that nothing would happen. It was exhausting just to think about going up against them. What happens to me if I do this? Josh asked, his voice wary. Will they come after me? Retaliate? Hayes sighed, rubbing his temple as he considered the question. That's always a risk, but you're not alone. Not entirely. Josh looked down, his hands clenched in his lap, the frustration and anger swirling within him, threatening to boil over. I don't want to be here again. I don't want them to think they've won. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, a gentle, reassuring gesture. You'll do what feels right. No one can decide that for you. The door opened again, and Reed stepped in, his face lighting up with surprise and relief as he saw Josh sitting with Hayes. Josh, they're letting you go? Josh nodded, a faint smile on his face. Looks like it. Reed glanced at Hayes, nodding in respect. Thanks, Officer Hayes. Really? Hayes smiled slightly, his gaze lingering on Josh with something close to pride. Just make sure you stay out of trouble, all right? Josh nodded, the weight of the day's events settling heavily on his shoulders. I'll try. Hayes stood, giving Josh one last look. Take care of yourself, kid, and remember, the world's only as good as the people willing to stand up for it. With that, Hayes turned and left, leaving Josh and Reed alone in the room. Reed let out a long breath, grinning at Josh. Man, I thought they'd never let you out of here. Josh managed a tired smile. Me too. Reed's face grew serious, and he lowered his voice. Listen, if you ever need someone who's got your back, I'm here. Josh nodded, the relief mixing with gratitude. Thanks, Reed. Really? As they walked toward the final door, toward freedom, Josh's thoughts churned. Part of him wanted to leave it all behind, to never think about Crane, Miller, or Lucas again. But another part of him knew that men like them would keep abusing their power unless someone made a stand. As they reached the exit, Josh paused, looking at Reed with a contemplative expression. Do you think, if I reported them, anything would actually change? Reed's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful, almost haunted look. I think, even if it doesn't change them, it might help someone else down the line. People like us, we don't always win. But sometimes, just trying can be enough to shake things up. Josh nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Reed's words settle over him. As the cool night air hit his face, he felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He was free, but the ordeal had left marks that wouldn't fade so easily. Take care of yourself, Josh, Reed said softly, clapping him on the shoulder. You too, Reed, Josh replied, his voice tinged with gratitude. As he walked out into the night, Josh felt the first genuine smile cross his face in hours. For a brief moment, he was free from the small, dark room, from Crane and Miller's taunts, from Lucas's venomous gaze. But he knew that if he didn't stand up now, those memories would haunt him forever. He took a deep breath, gazing up at the stars, a newfound resolve settling in his heart. He wouldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. The relief of freedom was short-lived. As Josh stepped into the open air, feeling the cool night breeze against his face, his thoughts continued to churn. It wasn't enough just to walk away. Every taunt from Crane and Miller, every condescending sneer from Lucas, echoed in his mind. They had made it clear. They believed themselves untouchable, powerful beyond consequence. As Josh turned down a quiet street, contemplating his next steps, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Parker." It was Officer Lucas, emerging from a nearby alleyway, his expression shadowed under the street lamp's glow. Josh froze, his heartbeat accelerating. "What do you want, Lucas?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Lucas stepped closer, a sly smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Relax, Parker. I just wanted a little chat." Officer to citizen. Friendly advice. Josh narrowed his eyes, his fists clenching involuntarily. "Advice?" he echoed, barely containing his bitterness. "I think I've had enough of your advice." Lucas laughed, a low, humorless sound. "I figured as much. You know, for a kid who thinks he's so smart, you really don't get how the world works, do you?" Josh's eyes darkened, his jaw tight. "And you think you do? Is this how you get your kicks? Abusing your badge?" Lucas's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He stepped closer, his gaze hardening. "Let me explain something, Parker. People like me? We don't get where we are by playing nice. The sooner you understand that, the better off you'll be." Josh held his ground, forcing himself to meet Lucas's gaze without flinching. "So you're admitting it? That you're just a bully in a uniform?" Lucas shrugged, his expression unrepentant. "Call it what you want, but this uniform, it gives me power. Power over people like you. And as much as you might hate it, that's how things work." The cold arrogance in Lucas's tone made Josh's stomach twist. "You're not invincible, Lucas. You act like you're untouchable, but you're just hiding behind that badge." Lucas's eyes flashed with anger, and he took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Be careful, Parker. You're walking on thin ice. I could make your life a lot harder than it already is." Josh's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. "Do whatever you want, Lucas. You might be able to intimidate people now, but eventually, someone's going to hold you accountable. You can't get away with this forever." Lucas's lip curled into a sneer, his fists clenched at his sides. "I've been on the force for over 15 years, Parker. I've seen kids like you come and go, thinking they're going to change the system. You're nothing special." Josh felt a surge of defiance rise within him. "Maybe I'm not, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you keep walking all over people. Your badge doesn't make you better than anyone else." Lucas let out a harsh laugh, crossing his arms as he looked Josh up and down. "You really think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Newsflash, kid. There are no heroes in the real world, just survivors. And people like me? We survive because we understand how to use power." Josh's hands trembled slightly, his anger barely contained. "Power doesn't make you strong, Lucas. It just makes you a coward who hides behind it." For a moment, Lucas's face twisted with anger, and he looked like he might strike out. But instead, he leaned in close, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "Keep talking, Parker. See where it gets you. You don't know what you're dealing with." Josh took a steadying breath, meeting Lucas's gaze without fear. "I know enough. Enough to see right through you." Lucas glared at him, his expression filled with a mixture of contempt and frustration. He took a step back, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts, Parker. You're just another kid who thinks the world owes him something. But the world doesn't care about you. It never did, and it never will." Josh felt a pang of something almost like pity as he looked at Lucas, seeing the bitterness and arrogance that seemed to define him. "Maybe it's the world that doesn't care about you, Lucas. Maybe that's why you need this badge so badly." Lucas's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "Watch yourself, Parker. Some advice? Don't come looking for trouble. You might find more than you're ready for." Without waiting for a response, Lucas turned and strode off into the night, leaving Josh standing alone in the cold. For a moment, he felt a shiver run down his spine, the weight of Lucas's words settling over him. The threat had been thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Josh clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of anger and determination simmer within him. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, a dark reminder of the twisted power dynamics that men like him thrived on. But he refused to let that fear take root. He knew, deep down, that Lucas's power was built on intimidation, on fear. And he wouldn't let himself be another victim. Taking a deep breath, Josh turned and continued down the street, his resolve hardening with each step. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Josh walked home with a heavy heart, his mind still echoing with Lucas's sneering threats. The confrontation had left him shaken, but beneath the fear was a growing resolve. He couldn't just let this go. He had to talk to his father. General Parker's influence could make a difference, and though their relationship was strained, Josh knew that his father had a strong sense of justice, even if it often came with rigid expectations. When he arrived at home, the house was silent, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his head. Taking a deep breath, Josh made his way down the hall toward his father's study, the familiar smell of leather-bound books and faint cigar smoke lingering in the air. As he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, the weight of his own pride holding him back. This would be the first time he turned to his father for help in years. Finally, he knocked, pushing the door open before his father had a chance to respond. General Parker looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Josh," he said, setting down his pen, "it's late. What's going on?" Josh took a steadying breath, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. I need to talk to you. Something happened tonight, and I don't know who else to turn to." The general's face softened, his gaze sharpening with concern as he motioned for Josh to sit down. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Josh hesitated, trying to find the right words. I was detained by the police tonight, Dad. They didn't tell me why. Just pulled me off the street, took me to the station, and treated me like I was a criminal." General Parker's expression shifted, a storm brewing in his eyes. "Detained? For what reason?" Josh shook his head, his fists clenching as he recalled Crane, Miller, and Lucas's taunts. They didn't have a reason, not a real one. They just assumed things. And when I tried to defend myself, they threatened me. One of the officers, Lucas, he's the worst of them. He told me that I'd better watch myself, like he's waiting for me to slip up. The general's face hardened, his jaw set in a grim line. "Did they lay a hand on you?" Josh hesitated, the memory of Crane slamming him against the wall flashing through his mind. "One of them did. Rough handling, pushing me around. They enjoyed it, Dad. You could see it in their faces." A muscle in General Parker's jaw twitched as he listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. This is unacceptable," he muttered, more to himself than to Josh. No man under a badge should abuse his authority. Josh felt a surge of relief, grateful for his father's reaction, but he could still sense the hesitancy that lingered. "I want to report them, Dad. I need them to know they can't get away with this." The general met his gaze, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Josh, it's complicated. Filing a report doesn't guarantee justice. It's not as simple as calling out bad behavior. These men have rank, connections. A report could backfire, making things worse." Josh's heart sank at his father's words, the weight of frustration settling heavily in his chest. "So you're saying there's nothing I can do? I'm supposed to let them treat me like dirt because they wear a badge?" General Parker sighed, his expression conflicted. "I'm saying we have to be strategic. An accusation against the wrong person could cost me my standing. And if they retaliate, son, they could make life difficult for you, in ways you can't even imagine." Josh stared at his father, the disbelief and disappointment welling up inside him. "So that's it? We just ignore it because it might be inconvenient?" The general's gaze softened, and he reached across the desk, placing a hand on Josh's shoulder. "It's not that simple, Josh. I've spent my life dealing with men who think they're above the rules, both in and out of uniform. You have to pick your battles." Josh pulled away, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Pick your battles? That's what you always say, Dad. But maybe this isn't about strategy or convenience. Maybe this is about doing what's right." The general looked down, his hand falling away, his face shadowed with regret. "Son, you have no idea what you're up against. Sometimes the right thing isn't worth the consequences." Josh's voice grew heated, frustration and anger bubbling up. "That's easy for you to say. You don't have to live with the humiliation. They'll just keep doing this, treating people like they're nothing. And no one will stop them because everyone's too afraid of the consequences. General Parker's face tightened, a hint of vulnerability flashing in his eyes. Josh, you have to understand. This isn't about being afraid. It's about survival. I've seen what happens to men who go against the system without backup. You're my son, and I don't want you to be another casualty. Josh's chest heaved with emotion, the bitterness and disappointment boiling over. Maybe I'm not afraid of being a casualty, Dad. Maybe I'd rather stand up for myself than live in fear of these bullies. The general's gaze was steady, filled with a sadness Josh hadn't seen before. I raised you to be strong, Josh, but strength isn't just about standing up to others. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away. Josh shook his head, the sense of betrayal cutting deep. You don't get it, do you? You spent my whole life telling me about duty, about honor. But now, when I need you to stand with me, you're telling me to back down. The general closed his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. It's not about backing down. It's about protecting you. Even if you don't understand now. Josh stood up, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Maybe you're right, Dad. Maybe I don't understand. But I do know one thing. I can't just sit back and do nothing. Not this time. The general opened his eyes, his face shadowed with regret and resignation. Just be careful, Josh. You're my son. That's all I care about. Josh paused, his heart torn between the frustration and love he felt for his father. I'll be careful, but I won't stay silent. Without another word, he turned and left the study, the weight of his father's reluctance settling heavily on his shoulders. As he walked down the hall, he felt a mixture of anger and sadness swirling within him. His father, the man he'd looked up to his entire life, was advising him to turn a blind eye. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't just walk away. The conversation replayed in his mind as he returned to his room, the raw emotion leaving him feeling drained and yet somehow more resolved. He might not have his father's support, but he knew he couldn't let the injustice go unanswered. With or without help, he would find a way to make his voice heard. As Josh sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of his father's words pressed heavily on his mind. The sense of betrayal gnawed at him. His whole life, his father had been a symbol of strength, of unyielding principles, and yet, when it mattered most, he had chosen caution over courage. The anger and disappointment in Josh's heart felt almost too heavy to carry. He barely noticed the door open until his mother's soft voice broke the silence. "Josh?" she asked gently, her head peeking around the doorway. Her eyes were filled with concern, a warmth that cut through the tension. "May I come in?" Josh looked up, managing a weak nod. "Sure, Mom." She entered the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Her presence brought a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm raging inside him. She sat beside him on the bed, her hand resting softly on his shoulder. "I heard you and your father talking," she began, her voice steady, yet tinged with sadness. He means well, you know." Josh scoffed, his voice bitter. "Does he? Because it sounds to me like he's more worried about his career and reputation than doing what's right." She sighed, her hand giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "It's not that simple, Josh. Your father, he's seen things, endured things that you might never fully understand. The military isn't just his career. It's his life, his identity." Josh's fists clenched in frustration. "And what about me? Am I supposed to just sit back and let those cops get away with what they did? Am I supposed to be afraid just because they wear a badge?" She looked down, a hint of sadness in her gaze. "No, I don't expect you to live in fear. But I do want you to understand that sometimes life isn't black and white. Sometimes the lines get blurred, and standing up for yourself can come with a cost." Josh turned to face her, his expression filled with defiance. "Mom, they treated me like I was nothing. They humiliated me. And now I'm supposed to just forget it ever happened?" Her eyes softened, and she took a deep breath. "Of course not, Josh. But your father and I, we want to protect you. We don't want you to put yourself in harm's way out of anger." He pulled away slightly, his jaw set in determination. "But it's not just anger, Mom. It's about doing the right thing. Isn't that what you and Dad always taught me? She hesitated, her hand falling from his shoulder as she struggled to find the right words. Yes, Josh, but sometimes the right thing can look different from what we think. Sometimes we have to think about the bigger picture. Josh shook his head, frustration evident in his eyes. You know, I thought you'd understand. I thought maybe you'd get why I can't just let this go. She reached out to him, her voice filled with pleading. I do understand, sweetheart, but we also don't want you to be hurt. We don't want this to become a battle that could ruin your life before it's even started. Josh looked at her, a bitterness creeping into his tone. Maybe that's the problem, Mom. Maybe if more people actually fought back, things would be different. She looked down, her face shadowed with worry. And maybe you're right, but fighting doesn't always mean charging in headfirst. Sometimes it means finding a way to win without putting yourself in the line of fire. Josh's face hardened, and he stood up, walking to the window. He stared out into the dark street, his reflection faint in the glass. You know what, Mom? Maybe I'm not as brave as Dad, but I'm not afraid of standing up for myself. She rose, walking over to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. We're not asking you to be afraid, Josh. We're asking you to be wise. To consider that sometimes things have consequences we can't control. Josh shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. I thought you'd support me, but it feels like you're just telling me to back down. Her face softened, sadness and worry mingling in her expression. Josh, I love you more than anything, and because of that, I don't want to see you hurt. If you do this, if you push back, you need to be prepared for what could happen. Josh's jaw tightened, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside. Maybe I'll get hurt. Maybe things will get worse. But at least I won't have to live with the feeling that I let them win. She looked at him, her eyes filling with unshed tears. Just promise me you'll think this through. Don't make any decisions you'll regret. He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. I promise, Mom, but I don't know if I can live with myself if I don't do something. She nodded, understanding etched into every line of her face. Whatever you decide, just know that we love you, Josh, and we'll be here for you, no matter what. They stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Josh felt the warmth of her hand on his shoulder, a reminder of her love, even if they didn't see eye to eye. It didn't lessen the frustration gnawing at him, but it gave him a sliver of comfort. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're braver than you know, Josh, and I'm proud of you. No matter what you choose. Without another word, she turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Josh was left alone once again, staring at his reflection in the window, his mind a tangled web of emotions. The conversation had left him with a strange mixture of hope and despair, a reminder of the love that held him back and pushed him forward in equal measure. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the enormity of his decision weighing heavily on his heart. He knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. He would have to confront the injustices he'd faced, and even if he couldn't count on his parents to stand by him completely, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. Josh took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Josh spent the next few days in a tense haze, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like an anchor. He tried to move through his daily routine, but the memory of Lucas's smirk and the humiliation he'd endured at the station haunted his every thought. It wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about dignity, about proving to himself that he wouldn't back down. Late one evening, his phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. Reed's name flashed on the screen. Surprised, he answered quickly. Reed. Josh, hey. I know it's late, but I thought you'd want to hear this. Reed's voice was steady, but there was a hint of something beneath it. Hope, perhaps. What's going on? Josh asked, his heart pounding. There was a pause, and then Reed took a deep breath. I've been doing some digging carefully, of course. I found out that Lucas is already under investigation. He's been on the radar for a while now, thanks to a few other complaints. Josh's heart skipped a beat. Are you serious? Dead serious. It's not common knowledge, and I shouldn't technically be telling you this, but you deserve to know. He's not as untouchable as he thinks, Reed continued, his voice filled with an urgency that was contagious. For the first time in days, Josh felt a flicker of hope, a light breaking through the darkness that had surrounded him. What does that mean for me? Does it mean I have a chance at holding him accountable? Reed hesitated. Look, I can't promise anything, but if you were to come forward to file your report, it could add to the case they're already building. It might be enough to push things over the edge. Josh's hands tightened around the phone, his pulse racing with the possibility. You really think it would make a difference? I think it's worth a shot, Josh, but you'd have to be prepared. If you go through with it, things could get rough. Lucas has friends on the force, people who don't want to see him go down. You need to be sure. Josh closed his eyes, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He thought of his father's warnings, his mother's concern, but also of the nights he'd spent sleepless, replaying the humiliation over and over. Josh, Reed's voice brought him back, filled with a concern that resonated. Look, I know this isn't easy, but if there's anyone who deserves justice, it's you. A lump formed in Josh's throat. Thanks, Reed. It means a lot, knowing someone's in my corner. Always, man, Reed replied softly, and you're not alone in this. If you decide to go through with it, I'll back you up as much as I can. Josh took a deep breath, a resolve forming inside him. Then I'll do it. I'll file the report. Reed's voice brightened, filled with a quiet triumph. All right, I'll be there to help you every step of the way. As they ended the call, Josh felt a surge of determination flood through him, stronger than anything he'd felt since the ordeal began. For the first time, he had a direction, a plan. And with Reed's support, he knew he wouldn't be facing this alone. The next day, Josh met Reed at a quiet cafe away from the main streets. The place was nearly empty, a cozy refuge from the bustling city. Reed was already there, waiting at a corner booth, his gaze sharp but welcoming as Josh approached. Hey! Reed greeted him with a nod, gesturing for him to sit. Josh slid into the booth, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. So, how does this work? Reed leaned forward, speaking in a low, reassuring tone. We'll file a formal report. I'll help you outline everything. Dates, times, names, every detail. The more precise, the better. It'll go to internal affairs, and if they find enough evidence, they'll open an investigation. Josh nodded, absorbing each word carefully. And what about Lucas? If he finds out, won't he try to retaliate? Reed's expression grew serious. There's always that risk. But once internal affairs is involved, his hands will be tied to an extent. He'll be under a lot of scrutiny. Just keep a low profile, and if anything happens, let me know immediately. Josh clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with determination. I can do that. Reed placed a comforting hand on Josh's shoulder, his gaze filled with encouragement. You're doing the right thing, Josh. No one should get away with what they did to you. Josh looked down, a flicker of doubt passing through his mind. I just hope this doesn't blow up in my face. It's normal to feel that way, Reed assured him, his voice steady. But remember, you're not alone. And there's a chance this could change things, not just for you, but for others too. The two spent the next hour meticulously outlining Josh's statement. Reed guided him through every detail, helping him craft a narrative that was clear, precise, and unflinching. By the time they were done, Josh felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally lifted. As they stood to leave, Reed offered him a firm handshake, his gaze filled with pride. You're brave, Josh. More than you know. Josh managed a faint smile, the hope he'd felt on the phone with Reed returning, brighter this time. Thanks. I couldn't have done this without you. Reed nodded, clapping him on the shoulder. Now comes the hard part, waiting. Over the next few days, Josh tried to resume his routine, but the waiting was its own kind of torment. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart would leap, hoping for an update from Reed, from internal affairs, from anyone who could confirm that justice was on its way. One evening, Just as he was beginning to lose hope, his phone rang. He snatched it up, seeing Reed's name flashing on the screen. "Reed?" he answered, his voice tinged with anticipation. There was a pause on the other end, and then Reed spoke, his tone heavy with disappointment. "Josh, I'm sorry." Josh's heart plummeted. "What happened?" "Internal Affairs reviewed the report, but they're closing the case. Not enough concrete evidence," they said. "They don't want to pursue it." Josh's hand tightened around the phone, his throat thick with anger and despair. "So that's it? After everything, they just get away with it?" Reed's sigh echoed through the line, his frustration mirroring Josh's. "I'm so sorry, Josh. I wish I had better news." Josh closed his eyes, the bitter taste of defeat settling over him. So they were right then. Lucas, Crane, Miller. They knew no one would touch them. "Maybe this time," Reed replied softly, his voice filled with regret. "But don't think this means you've lost. You've made noise, Josh. People noticed. Sometimes that's the first step, even if it doesn't feel like it." Josh leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, struggling to keep his emotions in check. I just wanted them to know they couldn't treat people like that. And they know, Josh. Even if it didn't go the way we wanted, you showed them that they're not invincible, that someone was willing to stand up to them." Josh swallowed, the words bringing a small measure of comfort. "Thanks, Reed, for everything. Anytime, man. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As the call ended, Josh sat in silence, the hope he'd clung to slipping away, replaced by a quiet, simmering resolve. They might have escaped this time, but he knew he couldn't let them intimidate him. Not now, not ever. The days following the phone call from Reed felt like an endless cycle of frustration and helplessness. Josh tried to stay occupied, diving into school assignments and basketball practice, but the sense of injustice gnawed at him relentlessly. He found himself withdrawing from friends, pushing away their questions, unwilling to explain the weight he was carrying. One evening, Josh's best friend, Marcus, decided he'd had enough of Josh's silence. He cornered Josh in the locker room after practice, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. "All right, man," Marcus said, crossing his arms as he blocked the exit. "You've been shutting everyone out for weeks now. What's going on with you?" Josh let out a long sigh, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "It's complicated, okay? I don't really want to talk about it." Marcus's expression softened, but his stance remained firm. "Look, we've been best friends since forever. You don't have to deal with whatever this is on your own." Josh hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus, about what had happened. It wasn't that he didn't trust him, but the humiliation and anger felt too raw to put into words. Seeing Josh's reluctance, Marcus softened his tone. "Come on, man. Whatever it is, I'm here. You know that, right?" Josh looked up, meeting Marcus's steady gaze. There was an honesty there, a loyalty that made something inside him loosen. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "All right, but it's a lot." Marcus nodded, guiding him to sit down on the bench beside him. "I've got time. Lay it on me." Josh stared at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper as he began recounting the night he'd been detained. "A few weeks ago, I got picked up by the cops. They treated me like a criminal, Marcus. No reason, just because they thought I looked suspicious." Marcus's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "They did what?" Josh swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "They shoved me around, taunted me, made me feel powerless. And the worst part? One of the cops, Lucas, he basically told me that they'd get away with it, that no one would believe me." Marcus shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "That's messed up, Josh. I can't believe they'd, man. That's just wrong." I tried to fight back, reported it. Reed, one of the decent guys on the force, helped me file a report. But, Josh trailed off, a bitter laugh escaping him. "They dropped it. Not enough evidence, they said." Marcus let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand over his head. "So that's it? They just get away with it?" Josh nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Feels like it. Like no matter what I do, they'll always win." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the injustice hanging heavy between them. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone filled with conviction. "Josh, I know it doesn't seem like it now, but you're not powerless. There's got to be something we can do." Josh looked at him, a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "Like what, Marcus? I tried the right way, and they shut me down. What else is there?" Marcus's eyes lit up with an idea. "We get the word out. People need to know what happened. If they're not going to listen to a report, maybe they'll listen to us." Josh frowned, considering the suggestion. "You mean, go public?" Marcus nodded, a determined look on his face. "Yeah, think about it. If we tell people, post it online, get others talking, they can't ignore it. They'll have to take it seriously." A flicker of hope sparked within Josh. "You think it could work?" Marcus grinned, his enthusiasm contagious. "Absolutely. Social media is powerful, man. If enough people see it, they'll be forced to act." Josh took a deep breath, the idea slowly settling in his mind. He'd been so focused on following the official channels that he hadn't considered taking matters into his own hands. "All right," Josh said finally, his voice filled with a new resolve. "Let's do it." That night, Josh and Marcus sat together in Marcus's room, their laptops and phones scattered across the bed as they planned their approach. Marcus set up a social media account specifically for their cause, coming up with a catchy handle that would grab people's attention. "All right," Marcus said, typing away furiously. "We'll start with a video. Just tell your story, plain and simple." Josh nodded, his nerves tingling as he positioned himself in front of Marcus's phone, which was propped up against a stack of books. He took a deep breath, looking directly into the camera, and began speaking. "My name is Josh Parker, and a few weeks ago, I experienced something no one should have to go through," he started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was detained by the police for no reason, just because I looked suspicious. They taunted me, pushed me around, made me feel like I was nothing." He paused, swallowing hard as he recalled the details. "I tried to report them. I followed the process, hoping that justice would be served. But they dismissed it, said there wasn't enough evidence, that there was nothing they could do. Meanwhile, these cops, they go on with their lives, knowing they can get away with this." Marcus gave him an encouraging nod from behind the camera, his expression filled with pride. Josh continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not here to stay silent. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. If you've been through something similar, if you felt powerless against people who abuse their power, I want you to know, you're not alone. And together, we can make our voices heard." He finished, letting out a shaky breath as Marcus stopped the recording. "How was that?" Marcus grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Perfect. That's exactly what people need to hear." They spent the next few hours editing the video, adding captions and background information before posting it online. Within minutes, the video started gaining views, the comments section filling with messages of support, outrage, and stories from others who had experienced similar injustices. Josh watched, his heart pounding as the notifications continued to pour in. "Look at this," he murmured, scrolling through the comments. "People are actually listening." Marcus leaned over, a proud smile on his face. "Told you, man. This is just the beginning." As the days passed, the video gained traction, being shared across social media, sparking conversations, and catching the attention of local news outlets. Messages from journalists and activists filled Josh's inbox, each one amplifying his voice and the story he had to tell. One evening, as Josh sat in his room reading through yet another message of support, his phone rang. It was Reed. "Josh, you're making waves," Reed said, a hint of pride in his voice. "People are talking. This could be big." Josh smiled, the sense of accomplishment lifting his spirits. "I couldn't have done it without you and Marcus." Reed's tone grew serious. "Just be careful. Lucas and his friends, they're not happy about this. They're under pressure, and they might try to make things difficult for you." Josh took a steadying breath. "I know, but I can't back down now, Reed. Not after everything." Reed sighed, a mixture of pride and worry evident in his voice. "All right, just know I'm here if you need anything. You're doing something important, Josh. Don't forget that." As he hung up, Josh felt a newfound strength coursing through him. He was no longer alone, no longer silenced. His story was out there, and people were listening. The battle wasn't over, and there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time since that fateful night, he felt hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. As the days passed, Josh's video continued to spread, sparking heated conversations online. The messages of support poured in, but so did the comments filled with skepticism, even outright hostility. People questioned his story, accused him of exaggerating, of seeking attention. Each harsh word felt like a weight, pressing down on him, testing his resolve. One evening, as he sat alone in his room scrolling through the flood of comments, he felt his phone buzz. It was a text from Marcus. "Meet me at the cafe in 10. We need to talk." Josh's heart sank as he read the message. The tone felt urgent, and he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't good news. Pulling on a jacket, he slipped out of the house, his mind racing as he made his way to the cafe. When he arrived, he spotted Marcus sitting in a corner booth, his head lowered, hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. Marcus looked up as Josh approached, his face etched with worry. "Hey," Josh said, sliding into the seat across from him. "What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, setting his mug down and meeting Josh's gaze with a serious expression. "There's something you need to know. I got a call earlier from someone claiming to be, well, it sounded like one of Lucas's guys." Josh's stomach twisted. "What did they say?" Marcus hesitated. His jaw clenched as he seemed to search for the right words. They told me that if we didn't take down the video, things could get difficult for you. They mentioned stuff about school, sports, even hinted that your family might feel the consequences." A chill ran down Josh's spine, a sense of dread settling over him. "They're threatening me? For speaking out?" Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with concern. "Yeah, man, and they're serious. They want this quiet. Lucas and his friends don't want anyone looking into what they've done." Josh clenched his fists, the familiar anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'm not going to back down, Marcus. They don't get to control me, to silence me." Marcus's face softened, and he leaned forward, his voice a mix of concern and caution. "Josh, I'm with you 100%. But you need to think about this. They're playing dirty. They'll try to ruin you if it means protecting themselves." Josh's eyes flashed with defiance. "Then let them try. They've already taken enough from me. I'm not about to let them take my voice too." Marcus shook his head, his expression torn. "Just be careful, okay? You've got people in your corner, but Lucas and his crew, they're ruthless. They're not above making life miserable for anyone who challenges them." Josh took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I know, Marcus, and I appreciate you looking out for me, but I can't let them scare me into silence." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Finally, Marcus leaned back, a faint smile breaking through his worried expression. "You're braver than I could ever be, man. Just know, whatever happens, I'm with you." Josh managed to smile, the warmth of Marcus's support giving him strength. "Thanks, Marcus. It means a lot." The following day, Josh received another call, this time from Reed. His voice was tense, strained, as though he were carrying a burden of his own. "Josh, I heard about the threats," Reed said without preamble, his tone laced with frustration. "Lucas and his guys aren't giving up." Even with all the public attention, Josh felt a surge of anger flare up. "So what am I supposed to do, Reed? Just roll over and let them win?" Reed sighed, his voice filled with empathy. "No, Josh, but you need to know what you're up against. These guys have connections, and they're not afraid to use them. I'm worried they'll push until they break you." Josh gritted his teeth, the frustration bubbling over. "Isn't there anything that can be done? Isn't there anyone willing to stand up to them?" There was a pause, and then Reed's voice softened. "There are a few officers who believe in what you're doing, but most are too afraid. Lucas, he's cultivated a culture of fear around him. People know he's willing to go to any lengths to keep his record clean." Josh's fists tightened, his voice filled with determination. "Then I'll keep fighting. If no one else will stand up to him, I will." Reed was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, His voice held a hint of pride. "I admire your courage, Josh, but don't let it blind you. These men play dirty. If you're not careful, they'll turn everything you've worked for against you." Josh's voice softened, the anger giving way to a quieter, more vulnerable emotion. "I don't know what else to do, Reed. I can't let them keep doing this. I've been silent too long already." Reed's tone was gentle, but firm. "Then we'll keep going. Together. Just promise me you'll stay safe. There's more than one way to fight, and not every battle needs to be fought head-on." Josh nodded, the advice settling over him like a comforting presence. "I'll be careful, Reed. I promise." Later that night, as Josh sat alone in his room, a sense of weariness washed over him. He'd thought that standing up to Lucas would bring relief, a sense of empowerment, but instead, he felt the weight of every decision, every consequence, pressing down on him. A soft knock at the door broke the silence, and his mother stepped into the room, her eyes filled with concern as she took in his exhausted expression. "Josh," she murmured, coming over to sit beside him on the bed. "I can see this is taking a toll on you." He looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, Mom. They're relentless." She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "Strength doesn't mean you're not scared, honey. Strength is doing the right thing, even when it feels impossible." He leaned into her, allowing himself to draw comfort from her presence. I thought things would change, that maybe people would care." She nodded, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "And many do, Josh. Your voice is reaching people, inspiring them. But sometimes change takes time. Sometimes it's a fight we don't see through to the end." Josh's throat tightened, and he blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know if I can keep going." She pulled back, looking him in the eyes, her gaze steady and filled with love. "You're stronger than you know. And even if this doesn't end the way you hoped, you'll have done something meaningful. You'll have stood up, shown courage. That's something no one can ever take from you." Josh nodded, a flicker of strength reigniting within him. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." She smiled, brushing a hand over his hair. "Whatever happens, we're here for you. And remember, you've already made a difference just by speaking out." They sat together in silence, the weight of the battle still heavy, but tempered by the love and support surrounding him. For the first time in days, Josh felt a glimmer of peace, a quiet assurance that, whatever happened, he wasn't alone. The support Josh had received gave him strength, but each day was also a battle against the relentless wave of threats and backlash. One evening, as he returned from basketball practice, he noticed something strange as he approached his house. A sleek, black car parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the figure inside was barely visible. Josh felt a shiver run down his spine. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder as he reached his front door. But before he could enter, the car door opened, and a man stepped out, a tall figure with a strong build and a cold, calculating gaze. "Josh Parker," the man called, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made Josh's stomach tighten. Josh turned, forcing himself to stand his ground. "Who's asking?" The man gave a thin smile, his eyes devoid of warmth. "I'm someone who's been sent to advise you. It would be best if you reconsidered the recent choices you've been making." Josh's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his tone steady. "I know who sent you. Tell Lucas that his threats won't work." The man took a step closer, his face partially hidden in the dim streetlight. "Is that so?" He tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're in over your head." Josh swallowed, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "You can try to intimidate me all you want, but it won't change anything. People are watching now. I'm not alone." The man's expression hardened, and he took another step forward, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "You think people watching makes you safe? You think you're untouchable because of a few internet posts?" Josh felt a flicker of fear, but pushed it down. "I think that if anything happens to me, people will know who's responsible. You can't just make this disappear." The man's eyes narrowed, his voice a cold, dangerous hiss. "You're just a kid, Parker. A kid who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. Take this as a final warning. Stop talking, or we'll make sure you regret it. With that, he turned and walked back to the car, his presence lingering like a dark cloud even after he'd driven away. Josh stood frozen in place, the weight of the threat settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He clenched his fists, breathing heavily as he tried to shake off the fear that gripped him. Inside the house, Josh's parents immediately noticed his tense demeanor. His father looked up from his newspaper, a crease of worry forming on his brow. "Josh, is everything all right?" General Parker asked, setting the paper aside as he studied his son's face. Josh took a deep breath, steeling himself. "No, Dad, it's not. Lucas, he sent someone to threaten me. Told me to back down or else." The general's expression darkened, and he rose from his seat, his posture tense and unyielding. "He did what?" Josh nodded, his voice thick with frustration. "They're not just empty threats, Dad. They're serious. They're not stopping until I'm silent." General Parker's gaze hardened, his hands clenching into fists. "This has gone too far. I was willing to let the situation settle, but they crossed a line. Threatening my son? That's not something I'll stand for." Josh's mother, who had been listening in silence, placed a hand on Josh's shoulder, her expression filled with worry. "Are you sure you're safe, honey? Maybe we should call someone. Get protection?" Josh shook his head, the fear he'd been holding back spilling over. "Protection won't stop them. They're willing to do anything to protect themselves. They're trying to make me feel powerless." The general's face was grim, his voice low and firm. "Then it's time we remind them that they're not the only ones with power." Josh looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" General Parker met his gaze, a steely determination in his expression. "I mean that I have friends, people who won't stand by while law enforcement bullies my son. If Lucas and his friends want to fight, they'll get one. We'll use every legal channel available to expose their actions." Josh felt a surge of relief, though he knew the battle was far from over. "Thank you, Dad. I can't do this alone. Not anymore." General Parker placed a firm hand on Josh's shoulder. "You won't have to, son. We're going to face this together." The next morning, Josh and his father arrived at the police department together, their faces set with determination. They'd arranged a meeting with the department's Internal Affairs Division, and as they walked through the halls, every step felt like a declaration of defiance against the intimidation tactics that had haunted Josh for weeks. When they reached the conference room, they were met by Officer Reed, who greeted them with a nod of respect. "Good to see you, General Parker." "Josh." General Parker extended his hand, shaking Reed's firmly. "Thank you for meeting us, Officer Reed. We're here because the situation has escalated beyond what's acceptable." Reed's face was somber, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. "I heard about the threats. I want you both to know that there are people within the department who won't stand for this. I'll do everything I can to support you." As they settled into the conference room, Reed went over the protocols, explaining the complaint process and the importance of documenting every detail. The general listened intently, his gaze hardening with each new detail. "Lucas and his team think they're untouchable," Reed explained, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "But if we have enough evidence, enough witnesses willing to stand with us, we can show that they're not above the law." General Parker nodded, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes, Officer Reed. I want these men held accountable." Reed met his gaze, a flicker of hope in his expression. "We're on the same page, General." Josh listened, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in the fight. His father, Reed, and even the support from strangers online. All of it had come together, giving him the strength he'd so desperately needed. As the meeting wrapped up, Reed turned to Josh, his expression serious. "You'll need to be careful, Josh. They'll push back, try to scare you, maybe even make this personal, but you've got people behind you now. We won't let them intimidate you." Josh nodded, a spark of determination igniting within him. "I know, and I won't let them win." As he and his father walked out of the police department, Josh felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The battle was only beginning, and the risks were higher than ever. But for the first time, he felt the strength of unity, of standing with others who believed in the fight for justice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and quiet tension. The official complaint had been filed, and Reed had promised to update them on any developments, but each passing day only seemed to heighten Josh's anxiety. Despite the steps they'd taken, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something. A confrontation, a consequence, or even just a sign that justice was moving forward. One evening, as Josh sat alone in his room, staring at the dim glow of his laptop, he heard a light knock on his door. His father stepped in, his expression soft yet resolute. "Mind if I come in?" General Parker asked, his voice low. Josh nodded, gesturing to the chair by his desk. "Yes, sure." His father sat down, the usual authority in his posture softened by a vulnerability Josh wasn't used to seeing. For a moment, they sat in silence, each trying to gather their thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about all of this," his father began, his gaze steady. "What you're doing, it's more than just standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for anyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Josh looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't feel that way sometimes. It feels like I'm fighting alone." General Parker reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Josh's shoulder. "You're not alone, son. You have me, your mother, Reed, and even strangers out there who've been inspired by your story. You're giving people hope, even if you can't see it." Josh's throat tightened, and he nodded slowly. "It's just hard, you know, knowing that there's a chance nothing will change. That Lucas and people like him might keep doing this to others." The general's gaze softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Sometimes the world doesn't change as quickly as we'd like, but that doesn't mean your actions don't matter. Every voice, every stand. It all adds up, even if the difference isn't immediate." Josh leaned back, a mix of frustration and determination swirling within him. "I just keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing. If this is worth it." His father's hand squeezed his shoulder, his voice gentle yet unwavering. "Let me tell you something, Josh. In my career, I've seen men face impossible choices, situations where doing the right thing came with consequences. But the ones who chose integrity, they're the ones who could look themselves in the mirror. And that's worth more than any comfort or safety." Josh looked up, his eyes meeting his father's with a new sense of understanding. "I want to be that person. I want to be able to live with myself, no matter what." The general nodded, a proud smile breaking through his stoic expression. "Then you're already doing the right thing. And no matter what happens, you'll have something Lucas can never take from you, your honor." They sat in silence, the weight of his father's words settling over Josh like a warm blanket, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in weeks. His father, a man he'd sometimes felt disconnected from, was now his anchor, his reminder that strength came not from power but from resilience. Just then, his phone buzzed, breaking the quiet moment. Josh glanced at the screen, his heart leaping as he saw Reed's name flash across it. He quickly picked up, his voice filled with anticipation. "Reed, did something happen?" Reed's tone was serious, his words measured. "Josh, I wanted you to hear this from me. The Internal Affairs Review Board has agreed to open a formal investigation against Lucas and his team." Josh's pulse quickened, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. Are you serious?" "Yes," Reed confirmed. "It's not a guarantee of justice, but it's a step in the right direction. They'll be reviewing all the reports and complaints, yours included." "It's finally happening." Josh let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Reed, for everything. I don't think I could have done this without you. You're the one with the courage, Josh," Reed replied, a note of pride in his voice. "But listen, now that things are moving forward, you need to be prepared. Lucas and his guys, they're not going to take this lying down." Josh glanced at his father, who was listening intently, and nodded. "I understand. I'll be careful." They ended the call, and Josh looked up at his father, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "They're actually opening an investigation, Dad. This is really happening." General Parker's face softened, a look of pride and relief shining in his eyes. "You did this, Josh. You stood your ground, and now things are finally moving forward." Josh took a deep breath, letting the reality of it sink in. But beneath the relief was a growing sense of unease, a knowledge that Lucas wouldn't go down without a fight. The general seemed to sense his son's worry, and he placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Remember, son, you're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Josh nodded, the determination in his father's eyes giving him the strength he needed. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't back down. This was bigger than him now, a fight not just for justice, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The atmosphere at home was tense yet hopeful as Josh, his father, and his mother prepared for the difficult days ahead. Each moment felt charged with anticipation, as if they were on the brink of something monumental. Josh's mother, usually gentle and reserved, seemed more watchful, while his father was as vigilant as ever, quietly checking in with contacts and reinforcing his own support network. One evening, as Josh sat at the kitchen table, poring over the stack of documents related to his case, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw his father enter the room, his expression serious yet calm. "Mind if I join you?" General Parker asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Josh nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Of course, Dad." The general settled into the chair, taking a moment to glance over the papers strewn across the table. He studied Josh for a moment before speaking, his voice soft yet unwavering. "Are you holding up, son?" "Really?" Josh took a deep breath, letting the weight of his father's words sink in. "Honestly, I'm scared, I guess. There's just so much on the line. And even though the investigation is going forward, I keep thinking, what if it's not enough?" His father nodded, a flicker of empathy passing over his face. "I understand. This isn't an easy road, but you're doing something incredibly brave. Most people wouldn't have the courage to stand up like this." Josh looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of a report. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels overwhelming, like I'm fighting something that's too big for me." The general leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Sometimes, the things worth fighting for feel impossible. But remember, bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's facing that fear head-on, no matter how overwhelming it seems." Josh nodded, his father's words grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. "Thanks, Dad. I don't want to let everyone down. People are watching now, counting on me to follow through." "You won't let them down," his father said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But you also don't have to carry this burden alone. You've got people on your side. Reed, your friends, your mother and me. We're all here for you." Josh met his father's gaze, a glimmer of gratitude breaking through the worry in his eyes. "I know. I just hope that's enough." The general gave him a faint, encouraging smile. "It will be. You've got more strength than you realize, Josh. And when the time comes, I have no doubt you'll see this through." Later that evening, as Josh prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Marcus, asking him to meet at their usual spot by the basketball courts. Josh felt a surge of curiosity mixed with concern. Marcus rarely reached out this late, and he could sense the urgency in the message. Grabbing his jacket, he slipped out of the house and made his way to the courts. The night air was cool, and the distant hum of streetlights cast long shadows across the empty playground. When he arrived, he found Marcus waiting by the fence, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face partially hidden in the shadows. "Hey," Josh greeted, stepping closer. "What's going on?" Marcus looked up, his expression tense. "I needed to talk to you about something. It's important." Josh raised an eyebrow, the unease in his friend's voice putting him on edge. "All right, what's up?" Marcus glanced around, as if making sure they were alone, before letting out a deep breath. "I heard something today. One of my dad's friends works at the station, and he overheard Lucas talking. They're not just planning to make things hard for you. They're going to try and pin something on you. Something serious." Josh's stomach twisted, the fear he'd been trying to suppress rising to the surface. "What? How?" "They're planning to set you up, Josh," Marcus continued, his voice filled with urgency. "Maybe plant something in your car or your locker. Something that'll ruin your credibility." Josh clenched his fists, a surge of anger mixing with the fear. "Of course they are. They'll do anything to protect themselves, even if it means framing me. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes filled with worry. You need to be careful, really careful. If they go through with this, they'll try to destroy everything you've worked for. Josh nodded, his mind racing as he tried to process the information. Thanks for telling me, Marcus. I don't know what I'd do without you. Marcus managed a faint smile. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, remember? Josh felt a surge of gratitude, and he clapped Marcus on the shoulder. Yeah, I remember. I can't believe they'd go this far. Marcus's expression grew serious, his voice steady. People like Lucas don't care about right or wrong. All they care about is power and control. They're not used to being challenged, especially by someone like you. Josh nodded, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. I'm not going to let them scare me off. They've already taken too much. If they think a threat like this will stop me, they're wrong. Marcus's eyes softened, a hint of pride in his gaze. I know. You're stronger than they'll ever be. When Josh returned home, his mind was spinning with everything Marcus had told him. He found his father still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in his hand, his expression thoughtful as he looked up at Josh. Everything all right? The general asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Josh took a seat across from him, his face set with determination. Dad, Marcus told me something tonight. Lucas and his guys, they're planning to frame me. They'll try to plant something to discredit me. The general's expression darkened, his hand tightening around his cup. Are you sure about this? Josh nodded, his jaw clenched. Marcus heard it from a reliable source. They're desperate, Dad. They know the investigation is real, and they're not going down without a fight. The general sat in silence for a moment, a thoughtful frown on his face. Finally, he looked up, his gaze resolute. Then we need to be prepared. I'll make some calls, see if I can get eyes on your car and locker. If they try anything, we'll be ready. Josh felt a surge of relief, a sense of safety in his father's confidence. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. His father's face softened, and he reached across the table, gripping Josh's hand. We're a team, Josh. No matter how tough things get, remember that. They may have their tricks, but they underestimate what we're willing to do to protect you. Josh nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. I won't let them break me, Dad. Not now, not ever. As he went to bed that night, Josh felt the weight of the upcoming battle pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, a quiet, unbreakable resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been told they were powerless. No matter what came next, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was ready. The next day, as Josh prepared himself for school, a heavy sense of anticipation weighed on him. He knew what was coming, and his father's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Be prepared, son. We're watching, and we're ready. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he walked into the school hallway and saw Officer Lucas standing by his locker, flanked by Crane and Miller. The sight of them sent a chill through Josh's veins. He forced himself to keep walking, his pulse quickening as he closed the distance. A crowd of students had begun to gather, murmurs spreading as they watched the officers standing with intimidating authority. Parker, Lucas called out, his voice loud and sharp, cutting through the noise. We need to have a little talk. Josh swallowed, clenching his fists to steady himself. What do you want? Lucas gave him a cold, calculating smile. We're just here to do a little check. You know, in case there's anything you shouldn't have in this locker of yours. Josh's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. This was it, the setup Marcus had warned him about. But he forced himself to stay calm, meeting Lucas's gaze without flinching. I have nothing to hide, Josh replied, his voice steady, though his mind raced with fear and anger. Lucas's eyes narrowed, his smile disappearing. Is that so? Well, let's just make sure. He turned to Crane, who was already reaching for the combination lock on Josh's locker, forcing it open with a practiced ease. The crowd around them grew thicker, students whispering and exchanging looks as they watched the officers' every move. Josh's stomach churned as he saw Crane reach into the locker, his gloved hands rifling through Josh's things with cold precision. After a few seconds, Crane pulled out a small plastic bag, holding it up for everyone to see. Inside was a bag of what looked like illegal pills, the evidence glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway. Josh felt a wave of horror wash over him as Lucas held up the bag with a triumphant smirk. Well, Parker, I thought you said you had nothing to hide?" The murmurs in the crowd turned to shocked gasps, faces filled with disbelief and judgment as they looked at Josh. He felt the weight of their stares, the cold judgment pressing down on him like a lead weight. "That's not mine," Josh shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "They planted that. You all saw. I wasn't even near my locker." Lucas gave a mocking laugh, his eyes glittering with malicious delight. "Oh, come on, Parker. Blaming us now? You're digging your own grave, kid." Josh clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to demand that they believe him, but he knew that anything he said would only make him look more desperate. He looked around the crowd, searching for a familiar face, someone who might believe him, but the shock and doubt in their expressions was overwhelming. But just as he felt his hope slipping away, a voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough." General Parker's voice echoed through the hallway, silencing everyone as he strode forward, his gaze steely and unyielding. The crowd parted as he approached, his presence commanding immediate respect. Lucas's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure, turning to face the general with a feigned look of professionalism. "General Parker, didn't expect to see you here." General Parker's gaze was cold, unwavering. "And I didn't expect to see officers planting evidence in my son's locker. But here we are." Lucas's face flushed with anger, but he forced a smile. "With all due respect, sir, we're just doing our job. And it seems your son has been caught red-handed." The general took a step closer, his voice low and laced with steel. "I'm well aware of your tactics, Lucas, and I've come prepared. Everything you've done here, every word, every movement, has been recorded." Lucas's eyes widened ever so slightly, his confidence faltering. "What are you talking about?" General Parker reached into his pocket, pulling out a small recording device, holding it up for everyone to see. "I've had eyes on my son's locker since I learned of your intentions. Every second of this has been documented. And if you try to arrest my son based on your planted evidence, you'll have more than just the school to answer to." A stunned silence fell over the crowd as they absorbed the weight of the general's words. Lucas's expression twisted with anger, his composure unraveling as he realized the trap he'd walked into. You can't prove anything," Lucas spat, his voice filled with barely contained rage. General Parker's gaze remained steady, his voice calm and controlled. "Maybe not here and now, but I have enough to open an inquiry into your conduct. And trust me, this is only the beginning. Your days of bullying and planting evidence are over, Lucas." Lucas's face turned red, and he took a step back, his eyes darting between General Parker and the crowd, the anger and humiliation evident in his expression. "This isn't over, Parker," Lucas hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You might have won this round, but don't think for a second that I'm done with you." General Parker didn't flinch, his voice calm and resolute. "Oh, I'm counting on it, Lucas. Because next time, I'll have more than just a recording. I'll have every piece of evidence necessary to make sure you never hold a badge again." Lucas glared at him, his fists clenched as he struggled to keep his composure. Finally, he turned on his heel, signaling for Crane and Miller to follow him. They left the hallway in tense silence, the crowd parting to let them pass. As soon as they were gone, General Parker turned to Josh, his expression softening as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. Josh took a shaky breath, his mind reeling from the intensity of the confrontation. I think so. I didn't expect you to be here." His father's face softened, a hint of a smile breaking through his stern expression. "I told you, son, you're not alone in this, and I'll be here every step of the way." Josh looked around, meeting the eyes of his classmates, many of whom were now watching him with expressions of sympathy and respect. He could feel the shift in the crowd, a realization that he wasn't the villain Lucas had tried to make him out to be. "Thank you," Josh whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The general squeezed his shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. "You would have found a way, son. You're stronger than you know." As they walked out of the school together, Josh felt a newfound sense of freedom and relief. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt as though he'd gained ground, as though he'd turned the tables on Lucas and his cronies. And as they stepped into the sunlight, Josh knew that, no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. The weight of the confrontation lingered with Josh as he walked through the school halls the following day. Although the students who had witnessed the incident now looked at him with newfound respect, he knew that this wasn't over. Lucas's threat echoed in his mind, a reminder that the fight was still very real. But beneath his anxiety was a flicker of confidence, something he hadn't felt in a long time. His father's unwavering support had given him strength, and now he was determined to see this through. During lunch, as Josh sat with Marcus in the courtyard, the usual chatter around them felt distant, almost surreal. Marcus leaned over, his face serious. "Hey, how are you holding up?" Marcus asked, his eyes filled with concern. Josh took a deep breath, managing a faint smile. "I'm okay. Just trying to process everything." Marcus nodded, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "You know, after what happened yesterday, people are talking, Josh. They know you're not backing down. They know you're standing up to Lucas." Josh's smile grew, the support from his friend grounding him. "Thanks, man. I couldn't have gotten this far without you." Marcus looked away, a faint blush on his cheeks. "Come on, don't get all mushy on me now. We've got a battle to win." They both laughed, the tension easing slightly as they shared a moment of normalcy. But the relief was short-lived. Just as Josh was starting to feel a sense of calm, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Reed. "Meet me at the station as soon as school is out. We need to talk." Josh's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension settling over him. He glanced at Marcus, holding up the phone. "Reed wants to meet." "At the station?" Marcus raised his eyebrows, nodding. "Then we'll go together. I'm not letting you do this alone." After school, Josh and Marcus made their way to the police station. The familiar building loomed ahead, its cold, gray exterior a stark reminder of the ordeals Josh had endured. They stepped through the doors, and Reed was there, waiting, his face serious as he gestured for them to follow him into a small, dimly lit office. Once inside, Reed closed the door and looked at Josh, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "Josh, you did well yesterday. Standing up to Lucas like that. Not many people would have had the courage." Josh nodded, his jaw tight. "Thanks, but I know it's not over yet." Reed sighed, taking a seat across from him. "No, it's not. But something big happened today. Internal Affairs got a hold of that recording your dad made, and it sparked a lot of interest. Lucas and his team are officially under investigation, not just for your case, but for multiple complaints filed by others." Josh's eyes widened, a surge of hope rushing through him. "So, they're finally taking this seriously?" Reed nodded. "Yes. They've put Lucas and the others on administrative leave, effective immediately. They're questioning witnesses, pulling case records." "This is serious, Josh." A rush of relief washed over Josh, the realization settling in that justice was finally within reach. But Reed's face remained serious, and a hint of worry crept back into Josh's mind. "There's something else," Reed continued, his voice dropping. "Lucas, he's not going down without a fight." His lawyer filed a counter-complaint, claiming that you and your father tampered with evidence, that the recording was staged to defame him. Josh's heart sank, the weight of the accusation hitting him like a punch to the gut. "But that's a lie. Everyone saw what happened." Reed held up a hand, his expression calm but firm. "I know, Josh, and Internal Affairs is aware that this is likely a desperate move on his part, but it means that this will be a long, drawn-out process. He's trying to turn the tables, make himself look like the victim." Josh shook his head, frustration boiling within him. This is exactly what he does. He twists everything to protect himself, How are we supposed to fight that? Reed's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, his voice gentle. You fight it by standing your ground. You've come this far, Josh. They're feeling the pressure, and that's why they're lashing out. This is their last-ditch effort. Marcus, who had been listening intently, spoke up, his voice filled with determination. We'll stand by you, Josh, whatever it takes. Josh looked between Reed and Marcus, feeling a swell of gratitude and resolve. I'm not giving up. I'm tired of being afraid. Reed gave him a nod of approval, a faint smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. Good. And know that I'm here every step of the way. I won't let them silence you. The weeks that followed were filled with intense scrutiny. Investigators from Internal Affairs delved into Lucas's history, unearthing a trail of complaints that painted a damning picture. But Lucas's countercomplaint cast a shadow over the case, drawing out the investigation and creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Josh did his best to keep his head up, focusing on school and leaning on his friends and family. He knew that the truth was on his side, but the constant battle was wearing him down. Still, he refused to let Lucas's tactics break him. One afternoon, just as he was leaving school, his phone buzzed with a message from Reed. They've scheduled a public hearing. Lucas and the others are being brought in to answer for their actions. Josh felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of justice finally being within reach. He immediately called Marcus, and within minutes, they were planning how to attend the hearing. The day of the hearing arrived, and Josh, his father, and Marcus sat in the audience, the air thick with anticipation. The room was packed, filled with spectators, reporters, and others who had come to witness the proceedings. At the front of the room sat Lucas, Crane, and Miller, each of them stone-faced. Their expressions hardened as they avoided eye contact with Josh and his father. As the hearing began, the lead investigator for Internal Affairs presented a detailed account of the officer's misconduct, supported by testimonies from witnesses, including Josh's own recorded statement. Each accusation chipped away at the once untouchable facade of Lucas and his colleagues, exposing the extent of their abuse. But Lucas's lawyer was prepared, using every opportunity to question the validity of the evidence, suggesting that Josh's story was a fabrication, a plot to undermine law enforcement. The tension in the room was palpable as each side presented their arguments, the fate of the case hanging in the balance. When it was finally Josh's turn to speak, he felt a lump form in his throat as he approached the stand. The weight of everyone's gaze pressed down on him, but he took a deep breath, focusing on his father's reassuring nod from the audience. My name is Josh Parker, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. And I'm here because I was treated like a criminal for no reason. I was humiliated, threatened, and told that no one would believe me if I spoke out. But I'm standing here now because I believe that justice matters, that truth matters. He paused, glancing over at Lucas, who was watching him with a scornful expression. They thought they could silence me, that I would be too scared to fight back. But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. No one should feel powerless in front of people who abuse their authority. As he finished, a ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and Josh felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spoken his truth, and he had done it with courage. The lead investigator concluded the hearing by outlining the next steps, promising that a full report would be made public. As the hearing adjourned, Josh and his family stood, feeling a sense of closure beginning to take shape. Outside the courthouse, Reed approached Josh, a proud smile on his face. You did good in there, Josh. No matter what happens next, you've already made a difference. Josh smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in months. Thank you, Reed, for everything. Reed clapped him on the shoulder. You've got more strength than most. Don't ever forget that. As they walked away, the weight of the journey lingered, but it was now a weight shared, a battle fought with unity and courage. Josh knew the fight wasn't completely over, but he had found his voice, his strength, and the unwavering support of those who believed in him. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up on the story, and soon Josh's experience became a topic of national discussion. His face was everywhere. Interviews, articles, even social media, where strangers reached out to express support and share their own stories of standing up against abuse of power. For the first time, Josh felt like his voice truly mattered, that he wasn't just another person being swept under the rug. But with this new visibility came a weight he hadn't anticipated, a constant stream of attention that both empowered and drained him. One evening, as Josh sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the latest article about the case, his mother entered the room, her face etched with concern and pride. "Josh," she said softly, coming over to sit beside him, "are you all right? You've been quieter than usual these past few days." Josh looked up, managing a faint smile. I don't know, Mom. It's all so much. I'm grateful that people are paying attention, that my story is making a difference. But I'm exhausted." She reached over, taking his hand in hers, her touch warm and comforting. "It's natural to feel that way, honey. You've been carrying so much. It's okay to feel overwhelmed." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I just keep thinking about everything that's happened. I wanted justice, but now it's become bigger than I ever imagined. People are expecting things from me, and I don't know if I can live up to that." His mother's eyes softened, and she wrapped her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "You've already done more than enough, Josh. You stood up when it was hardest, and you've inspired people to believe in themselves. That's a gift, but you're only human. Don't feel like you have to be perfect." Josh leaned into her embrace, letting out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Mom. I needed to hear that." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few months shared in the warmth of her embrace. Just then, his father entered the kitchen, holding a letter in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Josh," the general began, his voice steady, "this came for you. From the district attorney's office." Josh looked up, his heart skipping a beat. "The DA?" His father nodded, holding out the envelope. "It's about the charges against Lucas and his men. They've reached a conclusion." Josh took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. He scanned the words, his eyes widening as he took in the information. His father and mother watched him closely, waiting. "They're going forward with criminal charges against Lucas, Crane, and Miller," Josh said, his voice thick with emotion. "They'll be facing trial." A mixture of relief and disbelief washed over his parents' faces. His mother let out a soft gasp, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, Josh, this is justice." His father placed a firm hand on Josh's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "You did it, son. You fought and you won." Josh's throat tightened, a wave of emotion overwhelming him. He had dreamed of this moment, had fought and struggled for it. But now that it was here, he didn't know how to process the relief, the vindication, the knowledge that his voice had made a difference. I can't believe it," Josh whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't think this would actually happen." His mother wrapped him in a hug, her embrace strong and comforting. "You deserve this, Josh. You fought for the truth, even when it seemed impossible. And now, you can finally begin to heal." They held each other, the reality of the victory sinking in. But Josh knew that the fight wasn't over yet. There was still a trial to face, still a need to hold these men accountable in a court of law. The months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, interviews, and testimonies. Josh found himself reliving the events of that night over and over again, each detail becoming sharper, more painful as he was forced to confront the memories. But he faced each day with a quiet strength, his resolve growing with every hearing, every appearance in court. Finally, the day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and supporters, all of them waiting to see the conclusion of a case that had become a symbol of justice and accountability. Josh sat between his parents, their presence a steady anchor as they waited for the judge's decision. When the judge announced the verdict, guilty on all counts against Lucas, Crane, and Miller, a murmur of relief and approval swept through the room. Josh felt his heart pounding, the reality of the victory settling over him in a wave of relief and disbelief. Lucas and his men would face the consequences of their actions, and he could finally close this painful chapter. As they left the courtroom, Reed caught up to them, his expression a mixture of pride and admiration. "Josh," he said, reaching out to shake his hand, "you did it. I'm so proud of you." Josh shook his hand, a genuine smile breaking through the exhaustion that had lingered for so long. "Thank you, Reed. I couldn't have done it without you." Reed gave him a firm nod. "You had the strength all along, Josh. I was just here to support you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had shared hanging in the air. Finally, Reed stepped back, giving Josh a respectful nod. "Go enjoy this moment with your family. You've earned it." As they left the courthouse, Josh felt a strange sense of lightness, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted. He looked around at his parents, his friends, the people who had stood by him when things had seemed darkest. This victory was as much theirs as it was his. When they reached the car, Marcus threw an arm around Josh's shoulders, grinning. "So, Mr. Parker, how does it feel to be a hero?" Josh laughed, the sound filled with relief and joy. "I don't know about hero, but it feels good. Feels right." His mother smiled, wiping away tears of pride as she hugged him tightly. "You stood up for yourself, Josh. You've given so many people hope." Josh looked around, taking in the faces of the people who had supported him, who had believed in him when he had doubted himself. He realized that his journey wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about inspiring others to find their own voices, to stand up for what was right. As they drove away, Josh felt a peace settle over him, a quiet contentment that he hadn't felt in a long time. The scars from his ordeal would remain, but he knew now that they were a testament to his strength, a reminder that he had faced the darkness and come out stronger. For the first time, he felt ready to move forward, to leave the pain behind and embrace the future with hope and courage. Whatever came next, he knew he could face it. It had been a few weeks since the verdict, and life was slowly returning to normal for Josh. Each day felt like a gentle release, as if the tension that had gripped him for so long was finally unwinding. The attention around his case had mostly faded, and he found himself enjoying the quiet moments, sitting with Marcus at lunch, laughing with his parents at the dinner table, and just feeling at peace. One Saturday morning, as Josh was finishing up a jog in the park, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the lake. It was Reed, dressed in casual clothes, sipping a coffee and watching the water ripple under the morning sunlight. "Hey, Reed," Josh called out, jogging over with a smile. Reed looked up, grinning as he saw Josh approach. "Josh, good to see you. How've you been?" Josh took a seat beside him, catching his breath as he looked out at the lake. "Honestly, I've been good. Better than I've felt in a long time." Reed nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. "You've been through a lot, Josh. It's good to see you smiling." Josh glanced at Reed, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I still can't believe it sometimes. That it's over, that they face justice. I never thought things would turn out this way." Reed took a slow sip of his coffee, nodding as he looked at Josh. "You know, there aren't many people who would have had the courage to do what you did. You stood up when everything was stacked against you. That takes a rare kind of strength." Josh felt a warmth spread through him, Reed's words settling over him like a comforting blanket. "I didn't feel strong most of the time. I was scared, but I guess it was worth it." Reed smiled, his gaze shifting to the water. "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about pushing through, even when you're terrified. And because of what you did, others will think twice before abusing their power." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, Reed broke the quiet, his voice soft but serious. "Josh, there's something I want you to know," he said, turning to face him. "You've set an example, not just for your friends or this town, but for everyone who's heard your story. You showed them that it's possible to fight back, to make a difference." Josh looked down, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I just didn't want anyone else to go through what I did. If this helps even one person, then it was worth it." Reed reached over, giving Josh's shoulder a firm squeeze. "It was more than worth it. And you're not alone. There are people out there who are willing to stand up, just like you did. You've inspired them, Josh." Josh felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, and he met Reed's gaze, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Reed, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Reed smiled, nodding as he rose from the bench. "Anytime, kid. And remember, You're stronger than you know." As Reed walked away, Josh sat for a moment, watching him disappear down the path. The world around him felt vibrant, alive with possibility. He realized that he was no longer carrying the weight of fear or anger, that he was free to move forward with a sense of peace and purpose. That evening, Josh and his parents gathered around the dinner table, the warmth of the family filling the room. His father poured each of them a glass of sparkling cider, lifting his glass with a proud smile. "To Josh," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "to his courage, his integrity, and the strength he's shown. We couldn't be prouder." Josh raised his glass, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. And thank you, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you." His mother reached across the table, her hand covering his. "We're a family, Josh, and we'll always stand together." They clinked their glasses, the sound a soft, joyful note that filled the room. Josh looked around, feeling a sense of belonging, of love and unity that had only grown stronger through their shared ordeal. As they began to eat, his father looked at him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Josh, now that everything's settled, have you thought about what's next?" Josh set down his fork, considering the question. "I've been thinking a lot, actually. I want to help people. Maybe study law or social justice. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." His mother's face lit up with pride, her eyes shining with tears. "That's a beautiful goal, Josh, and I know you'll make a difference." His father nodded, his gaze filled with approval. "You have my full support, son. Whatever path you choose, just know that we're behind you." Josh felt a surge of determination, a quiet resolve settling within him. This journey had changed him, had shown him a path he hadn't considered before. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, bolstered by the love and support of his family. As the evening drew to a close, Josh found himself standing alone in his room, looking at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a young man who had faced his fears, who had stood up against the odds, and he felt a sense of pride that he'd never felt before. He took a deep breath, his heart filled with gratitude and a sense of purpose. He knew that this chapter of his life was closing, but he also knew that the lessons he'd learned, the strength he'd discovered, would guide him in whatever came next. With a final look in the mirror, he whispered to himself, "You did it." And as he turned off the lights and lay down to sleep, Josh knew that he was finally at peace, ready to embrace the future with an open heart and a spirit unbroken. What a journey! Josh's story reminds us that the fight for justice often comes at a cost, and sometimes, even just speaking out can feel like an insurmountable challenge. His courage, resilience, and commitment to standing up against injustice show us that real change often starts with a single voice. When we see someone facing adversity, we have a choice to stand by them, to believe in their truth, and to amplify their voice. Together, our actions create ripples that can build into waves, impacting lives and, hopefully, bringing about change. So, let's remember that even the smallest act of support or kindness can make a difference. Josh's story is a powerful reminder that we all have the potential to create change, no matter how daunting the circumstances may seem. If this story inspired you, please subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and let's continue to spread hope and compassion. Your support helps us share more stories like this.